Is the Kremlin indoctrinating school children as young as 15 in the military and Putin's unique view of Russia's war in Ukraine? But more importantly, why are they doing it? And are they preparing for another generation of combat? Let's talk about this, plus the Ukrainian innovations in FPV drones, the unjammable drone with a range up to 50 kilometers, plus European companies busted violating sanctions, and Trump's bizarre direction about all grants and aid. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's crack into it. Okay. So this I thought was a really interesting story that the latest Russian school textbooks say that Moscow was actually forced into war in Ukraine, which is kind of a hot take, right? In fact, the textbook, which was authored, by the architect of kind of Putin's ideology, Vladimir Medinsky, he has actually argued that Ukraine, in this book, he's telling kids around basically high school age kids, 14, 15 years old, that Western influence shifted Ukraine into, quote, an aggressive anti-Russian bridgehead, which is a really tough take given that aggressive is probably a stretch, given that the Ukrainian military's only objectives, even in 2014, were the defense of Crimea and Donbas. And while probably not technically untrue, that it sounds like it was less about Western influence and more about the Ukrainians themselves being mad that Russians took their land. It's a really not that subtle distinction, but do you really think that the Russian Ministry of Education is going to do anything other than spew blatant, brazen propaganda? I can barely talk today. So now, this is pretty interesting because this isn't the only place that military propaganda is being pushed into Russian schools, right? And this is part of what I thought was a really interesting kind of larger relationship that Russia's trying to reimagine between the state, the government really, and its war veterans, right? And part of what's happening is that a lot of returning special military operations veterans are actually being linked up with young teenagers, right? This is, of course, in some instances, they're NGOs that provide military training for different age groups, including teenagers. But you also have veterans addressing school groups as young as kindergarten age and giving basic weapons training to students, which as of September is a mandatory part of every curriculum starting in 8th grade, right? Of course, there's billboards just proclaiming the heroism of soldiers on major roads, and Kremlin has made a big show of appointing veterans to top jobs. In fact, their state-run TV channel has an hour-long show that simply offers praise to veterans, right? Giving live performances and others telling of their heroism on the front lines. And so what I think is so interesting about this, of course, veterans from this war, like veterans from almost every war, the reality is kind of messy, right? There's, some critics are saying that this sort of praise of veterans is largely performative, that there's not real help for psychological struggles or even necessarily good quality medical care for veterans. And what I thought was really interesting is that I think this serves two purposes. The first is, of course, this Kremlin militarization of young people is part of the Russian recruitment scheme, right? If young kids, impressionable kids, get a favorable view of the military or a humanized version of the military, they're more likely to sign up when they turn 18, right? But you may think that even if you're spewing propaganda to a 15-year-old, you have 3 years until they're eligible to sign up for military service. That should be somewhat alarming because it indicates that Putin expects to have a military of a huge size, comparable to what he has now, in the coming 3 to 5 years. And remember, if you're talking about kindergartners, you're talking about individuals who won't be able to serve in their military for over a decade. And so, what does this say about Putin's larger plan? Well, again, Putin has been following pretty deeply the playbook of this individual, Medinsky, who holds that the Russian armed forces, or particularly the Russian army, is the natural power of what he sometimes calls the Eurasian continent. So there's an indicator, at least, that this militarized Russia may be eyeing not just Ukraine, but to march further and further into Eastern Europe and into other regions where they expect fighting, where they expect to be, well, marching, right? They're not going to win by propaganda. They're going to win by military, by force of arms. But what's also really interesting is that part of the reason the Kremlin is so adamant about integrating their veterans is the Russian experience in Afghanistan and Chechnya, right? In these wars, the military, or really the Kremlin, tried tirelessly to hide the true casualty numbers of these conflicts. And that meant that they intentionally would bury, proverbially, the deaths of soldiers. They would not publicize funerals. They would also not really publicly acknowledge the service members who were wounded, or even necessarily their service. They wanted the idea of these wars to become as invisible to the Russian public as possible. But it backfired very badly, because what you had were these groups of veterans who came back and they looked around and they said, wow, the government literally pretends we don't exist, pretends that we never fought, we never existed. And they said the only people who understand what we've been through, who care what we've been through, is each other. And what happened is, when you had these people who were skilled at force of arms, very highly organized, very capable, and very loyal, right? All traits that you tend to develop as a function of being in the military and combat. It meant, and they had no loyalty to their central government. That meant that they became some of the most hardened organized crime organizations in the world at the time, right? If you remember the 90s, the Russian mafia was considered unbelievably dangerous. And in a lot of European countries, their homegrown organized crime organizations were literally wiped out by these Russian veteran gangs. And that meant that the Russian state actually turned around and said, this is a huge problem, because these are individuals who are as skilled and capable of violence as our police forces, as our military, in some cases much better at it. And they're operating against us. They're dealing drugs. They're engaging in human trafficking, right? They're doing all these organized criminal activities. And they're tightly bound. They're hard to break apart. Ultimately, the solution the Russian government had to come to was that they brought them in. They brought them into the government. And so for Putin, he's saying, listen, we have to get ahead of this. We have to not create this giant group of disenfranchised, angry, combat experienced men. They're all men. And so to do this, he said, we're going to bring them into the government on as many levels as possible to make them feel seen and heard. So this, I think, is an interesting strategy. Now, the question is, will it work? Will being brought into the government create the effects that it wants? Or will it look more like the Wagner Group, where you are simply speed running the infiltration of your government by kind of disaffected, I'm not going to say criminals, but, disaffected people whose loyalty is not to the central government, right? And I think that's the case in a lot of cases with U.S. veterans, right? There are very few veterans I know who proclaim love for the United States government, right? A lot of them love their country, right? And I'm one of them, right? But nobody, from this channel, right? I have grave criticisms with the U.S. government and how it's been run by both the left and right-wing parties of our country. So, I don't think that is a strategy. And it's one that, in a way, the U.S. government also kind of pursues, right? Federal employment is more favorable to veterans, again, to try to bring veterans into the fold of government, to say, hey, you know, the military to, for example, Border Patrol pipeline, very well trod. You know, one of the when I finished my graduate school, again, the Department of Homeland Security, private sector, I could not get an interview to save my life. Nobody was interested. Only incredibly low-paying, like hourly desk jobs was what were available in the private sector. Nothing related to my field. But with the government, I was able to get way more interviews, way more offers. In fact, I ended up with several job offers in government roles. And so I think that sort of tactic is a pretty savvy one, right? Now, before we talk about the Ukrainian FPV drone innovations, I wanted to at least talk about the fact that, well, if you're an FPV pilot, well, they've reached out to me and said, listen, send more gum. Why? Because energy drinks are expensive. They're carbonated. You have to haul them around. It sucks. And so I knew we needed to create a better alternative. That's why I created Strike Gum. 90 milligrams caffeine in every single piece, right? Zero sugar. And of course, it's made in the USA and obviously veteran owned. So if you're interested in picking up the all-American combat tested energy gum, go to strikegum.com. Link is in the description. By the way, end of January sale still going on, 20% off store-wide and free shipping on orders over $50. You can't beat it. Link's in the description. Plus, you can go on Amazon and pick some up, but, you know, go to Strike Gum, get the sale. It's a no-brainer. So, optical drones. This is an important one. Why? Because optical drones, these are drones that essentially have a fishing reel attached to them that spool out fiber optic cable, meaning that the operator and the drone are connected at all times. And there's no way that a jamming system, an electronic jamming system, can penetrate it. And the Ukrainians, right, the Russians actually were the first to pioneer this. And they deployed them to the front line, and the Ukrainians saw, damn, these things are actually really effective. A lot of people were skeptical. They said, you can't fit that much fiber optic cable onto a drone and still have the lift capacity to haul a warhead over a meaningful amount of distances, right? And so the Ukrainians have said, listen, clearly the Russians make it work. We think we can too. And so the 114th, aka the 114th Unmanned Strike Systems Brigade, known publicly as MHGR's Birds, have unveiled their first FPV quadcopter drone operated via a fiber optic cable, no kidding, that can go 41 kilometers, right? This is actually further than the operational range of current radio signal FPV drones. That is how intense this operating system is, which is wild. It means drone operators can sit literally almost 30 miles from the front lines. For context, guys, when I was in Ukraine, right? Let me see if I can pull up a map here. It's going to be a little dated, but I could show you guys. Actually, we'll pull it up for November when I was there, right? So we'll just do November 15th, right? Nope. Come on, you can do it. There we go. Okay. So November 15th, right? Here's where the front line was, and so literally, to give you context, when we got attacked by the drone, we were right around, I think probably somewhere, we were past Konstantinivka. We were probably right around here, right? Probably if we're talking about real roads. Yeah, probably right around here, right? Now, here's the thing. If you can get this drone to operate at 40 kilometers, guys, 40 kilometers, you can literally be sitting in Krematorsk. To give you an idea of how crazy that is, right? In Krematorsk, this is where, like, there are operating brew pubs. There's a regular grocery store. There's tens of thousands of civilians still living here. This is a regular city. I mean, obviously you can't miss the military everywhere, right? And you see some fab bombs, but you could literally be sitting in Krematorsk and be launching you could be operating a drone, an FPV strike drone, right? So you could really change the level of safety of a lot of these troopers, right? Again, in Chasiv Yar, you could literally be operating an FPV drone a mountain range away, which is pretty crazy. Even if you were to sit there and go, okay, we can't, 41 kilometers is the limit. Even if you were to say 20 kilometers, guys, it's hard to overstate how much safer it is to be this far back, right? So this is a potential massive innovation, and reportedly, they're already trying to produce 1,000 units of these strike drones. So again, you could either put the drone position really far forward, right, and still hit deep targets, as they point out, like artillery systems, Russian MLRS, and medium-range air defense systems, or you could set it way back and make your drone teams be far, far safer, right? So that is really, even 1,000 units a month would be unbelievable. Now, again, it requires cash. It requires a lot of money. A fiber optic drone is about, from what I've heard, around 10 times as expensive as a conventional drone. But remember, for an average pilot, right, only about 10% of FPV drones can penetrate through electronic signals and other countermeasures. So to hit a target, right, don't think about the FPV drone as a cost per drone. Think of it as cost per hit. And in terms of cost per hit, optical drones are actually right there competitive. And here's the thing with an economy of scale, right? But in both cases, this fiber optic cable is being produced by China. What happens is it becomes very profitable to produce fiber optic cable. Fiber optic cable production scales up as more Chinese factories come online or retool to produce fiber optic cable, and the cost per 100 meters of cable starts to drop tremendously. And so that's what you're going to see as the fiber optic cables begin to pervade the battlefield. And right now, nobody's figured out a really reliable counter. The most you've seen is the use of shotguns, literally skeet shooting drones out of the sky. But if you've ever shot skeet or trap, you know that it's only really effective inside 50 meters. And that's very close. You cannot miss. And even if you were to nail the drone dead to rights, a wounded drone may still simply land close enough to you to still wound you. So there really isn't an effective counter that has been deployed. Now, as we've talked about, at the end of the day, about 40% of Ukraine's budget is paid for by the US of A, right? And a lot of that, so the USA's budget, or rather its government budget, is of grave concern. So one of the things I thought was interesting is that the administration has directed federal agencies to pause the disbursement of loans and grants while the government conducts a review to ensure spending aligns with the president's agenda. Now, here is the problem, right? This is according to the Office of Management and Budget, have said that federal agencies should, quote, temporarily pause all activities related to the obligation of disbursement of federal financial assistance, right? And in some ways you go, okay, well, there's a lot of financial assistance where you're like, this is kind of ancillary, right? A lot of it is kind of sometimes feel good stuff, but a lot of this aid is not. And what it goes to is U.S. science research, right? The U.S. and its dominance over science is one of the most important things that we do, right? And it's clear the benefits. Look no further than the pandemic, right? Which country developed the first reliable vaccines, right? It was the US. China actually was so committed to a Chinese solution that they, for a year, kept their economy locked down, damaging their economy tremendously because they refused to use US vaccines directly. They wanted to develop their own, and they never did, right? So what is So when you see things like, oh, U.S. science research is going to get paused, it's a huge problem. It's a really red alert type of situation. And again, it's not clear that this is like fully legal. The Democrats point out that the Congress is responsible for allocating spending, and the executive branch, per the Constitution, cannot reallocate or change spending outside of what Congress authorizes. There's some stuff where Congress says, for example, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Congress allocated a special set of funds called contingency funds that said, listen, the commander-in-chief, you get to use these to fight the war that you need to fight today, right? But those are special funds that were given to the White House expressly for them to do with what they needed to do. But if Congress, for example, says, listen, here is $10 million, and it is to fund materials research, right? We are going to give grants to create the next generation of super materials that can be used for defense purposes or for, civilian manufacturing purposes. The government's like, Congress, like, this is the law is clear. This is how you have to use it. You cannot sit there and make believe that there is some kind of other that the White House can sit there and go, actually, Congress was just kidding about what those funds were used for. So I'll be very curious to see how this plays out in court. I'll be just so curious to see if this even gets held up under the law, because nobody even knows what the law means anymore. What is even the law? Anyway, I'm going to keep you guys posted as we learn more, but a huge thank you to the folks like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergey Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.